Welcome. Welcome to everyone who has come here this evening. We're ready to get started. Tara, do you want to come up? Tara Foeman is going to make some announcements, and then we'll get started with the program.
Thank you. All right. Good evening, everyone, and good evening to those joining us online. I'm Tara Foeman, Director of Advancement and Coordinator of Alumni Affairs here at Bernathen College. I'd like to welcome you to the return of the Distinguished Speaker Series. The college hasn't hosted this event in a few years. The last one that was scheduled was in March of 2020, and we all know how March of 2020 turned out for us. So events like this have been on pause due to COVID. And so I speak on behalf of the entire college when I say that we are delighted to be hosting more events on campus, such as this one. So I invite you to keep an eye on our social media, events calendars, and emails for future events like this, and also for more information about the Alumni Association, since we can relaunch that at this time. The Distinguished Speaker Series aims to bring outstanding alumni and friends of the college to speak to its students, alumni, and the community. So with that said, I'd like to have Brian Blair come back up here to introduce tonight's speaker.
Thank you, Tara. And it's wonderful to be back after 2.5 long years. So tonight we're going to talk about diversity, equality, and belonging. Those are the terms we use here at the college, and we shorten that to DEB. And we will be talking about how studying DNA and its associated ancestry can shed some light on where we've come from and maybe where we are going. But before I begin, I wish to open our program with some quotes from Emanuel Swedenborg's writings, which are the foundation of the new church faith. Here at Bernathen College, we are a faith-based school that believes in the power of God and his desire to see us all find a path toward a heavenly, eternal life. So I'd like to read a few quick passages for you from Emanuel Swedenborg's writings that speak a little bit to heaven and diversity. So the first passage comes from Divine Providence, which says, "The Lord's divine providence has as its goal a heaven from the human race." Second passage from Divine True Christian Religion, and this is, "Every community in heaven is growing in numbers daily, and more it grows, the more perfect it becomes. And in this way, not only is the community perfected, but heaven in general is perfected as well, since the communities constitute heaven. The diversity of people reflects the infinity of the Lord. The infinity of God can be seen by enlightened reason in very many things in the world. And some things shall be enumerated in which the human reason can see the infinity of God. And in the created universe, there are no two things that can be found that are identical. That such identity can be found among simultaneously things has been rationally seen and proved to be of human learning. And so although substantial and material objects of the universe are viewed singly, they are infinite in number." And finally, the third passage is that the Lord created a variety of people. Our task is to love the goodness in them. Since goodwill resides in the inner self where benevolence is felt, and then extends into the outer self where good actions occur, it follows that the people's inner selves are what we should love. And we should love their outer selves on the basis of their inner selves. And therefore, we are to love people according to the type of goodness that's inside. It is the goodness itself, then, that is actually our neighbor. So now I'd like to move on to have you know that it is a pleasure for us to have Dr. Anita Foeman, who is our speaker tonight. Dr. Foeman is an expert on the subject of workplace and educational diversity. I met Dr. Foeman just a little over a year ago through our former HR director, Renee Rosenfeld, who spoke very highly about Dr. Foeman's skills and credentials. And you know something, Renee never led me wrong. Dr. Foeman is a professor emeritus at the Communication and Media Department at Westchester University, where she taught for over 40 years. Dr. Foeman received her PhD from Temple University in 1982 in communications with concentration on organizational communication. She was also one of the first in her field to publish on diversity in the workplace as a positive, and I repeat, positive development. Her co-authored article, Ethnic Culture and Corporate Culture, published in 1987, was one of the first to articulate a positive image of workplace diversity. Dr. Foeman's ongoing scholarship and training has explored diversity in society, including multicultural organizations, families, and people. Her work includes over 30 years of ongoing diversity and leadership consulting for educational, government, and private agencies. Bernathen's College is really lucky because she also works at Haverford College and Princeton, among others, and her orientation has always been optimistic and inclusive. During her academic career, she has conducted extensive research on ancestry DNA data. She has authored many books and articles on the subject. Her work has been followed and reported in the New York Times, the Washington Post, Here and Now on NPR, the BBC NewsHour, the National Geographic Magazine, and National Geographic Explorer and Nova. She is currently engaged with the Bernathen College on assisting our Diversity, Equality, and Belonging Committee on approaches to meet the needs of our diverse student body and our employees. Dr. Foeman, along with our DEB committee, are mindful of the need to work within the framework of our new church faith while carrying out our duties with love and charity toward our neighbors. We will begin our program tonight with a few questions I will pose to Dr. Foeman, which deal with diversity in light of today's society. These questions are intended to set this table, actually, for her talk on ancestry DNA. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Anita Foeman. We hope this all goes well. This is a little different than what we normally do. So I'm going to ask a few questions, and Dr. Foeman's going to respond. But this is somewhat around some of the things we're talking about on campus right now, as we're in this recognizing the need to have such programs in place and better serve, as I said, our students and employees. So the challenges of dealing with diversity evolve as our nation's expectations continually change with public dialogue and news events that impact us every day. All communities are adjusting to an ever-changing landscape of social practices, government regulations, business, education standards, and being sensitive to the expectations and communicating how we speak to these subjects. So, with that introduction, Dr. Foeman, I want to ask you, can you share some of your thoughts on what you are observing in the DEB landscape?
Yeah, I'm here at the school. And I would say, after talking with dozens of people here, that there are really two areas of diversity that people are talking about. One is, there are multiple, but two that people focus on. One is around race, and one is around LGBTQ plus issues. And I would say that people there tends to be agreement around talking about race, even though the discussion about what to do about it, people might, feel differently about. And even some of the writings of the new church are even kind of forward about talking about race. In terms of the LGBTQ plus themes, there's much more of a variety of opinions. And the interesting thing is that I hear a range of people, and they all find things in the writings that seem to support them. I mentioned to several people that I've worked with a lot of religious organizations, and maybe I'm getting to the next question.
No,
Let me
you
use
go
this
ahead.
to
You're
slap
doing
me.
fine.
That with Quakers tend to be quite liberal. And so when I'm at Quaker organizations and institutions, that around the LGBTQ stuff, it's like, how can we get people in? There's that. And then when I've worked for Catholic organizations, somebody who will be a Catholic individual will say, I feel this way, but the Catholic Church feels another way, or I feel. And here it's fascinating because I hear a range of opinions, and people will all say, I find that the new church supports this. I don't think I'm inconsistent with the new church. And so it's an interesting conversation and tension, but I do think that I have heard people say they want to respect their neighbors, et cetera. And I guess the question is, the debate is around how that happens. And I just want to say one more thing. In terms of students, one of the things that's really important to me is that the school needs to make sure when you bring a student into your world that the college feels that they can support them, because you're sending somebody away from their home, their family, their support system, and whoever that is that you bring here, that they need to know that the B part, the belonging part, is an important factor. And that's something the school has to thrash out.
Thank you very much. So, could you comment on how you are seeing colleges and universities deal with DEB practices, especially those that are faith-based? And that's a little expansion of what you just said.
Yeah, and just, again, I would say it depends upon the faith. And I guess, again, there are, in my conversations with people, I would say at the one end, there are people who just feel that the religion doesn't support people who identify as LGBTQ plus. And there are conversations about whether the school should, be a tiny school that, that says the comments on that. The thing that I would say as I get ready to talk about DNA is that if you got rid of every gay student on campus now, people would graduate, get married, and have kids, and some of them would be LGBTQ plus, because that's, it's just part of, it's part of human diversity. I would also say that different organizations deal with diversity in a different way. You talked about religious organizations, but I taught for 40 years at a state school. And in Pennsylvania, you know that the state is very diverse. And so we had to it's almost the opposite of what you find here, that the students who are much more conservative would often find that they were bowled over in a world that was different than them. And we had to make sure that it was a safe space. And the same thing, if we bring them to campus, we have to let them know we love them too. And so on the other end, of course, you have people who feel like, they're citizens, et cetera, that they should be able to have clubs where they're celebrating who they are, et cetera. And I don't know that there is going to be some easy answer to that, because I didn't hear people say, gee, I'm going to change the way I feel. And, and Quakers talk about standing aside to to allow the consensus. But I will say that here, I've worked places where people have very nasty sort of ulterior motives. And I did feel when I was talking to people here that they were speaking from their heart. And so I think that if there is some way to allow people to continue to disagree on some of these things, I think the biggest challenge is that I know that the LGBTQ community wants to have like a club, and ideally it would be on campus like any other group. I think that there are strong feelings that are on the other side of that. And I guess my question, not for me, but for this community, is are there ways that the LGBTQ community can continue to share who they think they are and what? Because I think I do believe that there's a lot of education that continues. I don't know for anybody here, and I'm going to leave time after. I'm going to speak a little shorter than I thought so people can give their opinions. I know when I was growing up that anybody who was LGBTQ, first of all, I didn't even know the term LGBT. You know, when I was growing up, I didn't know the word lesbian until I was an adult, and I didn't, you know, I was like, what? So I think there's a lot of education that has to go on, and I think a lot of us grew up thinking it was a choice. I think we feel differently about that. I think there's a lot more insight and perspective, and I think we all have to be open to trying to understand who people are as we attempt to make judgments about them. And I mean, I think this is a wonderful place that people find. And the fascinating thing is, I would talk to people from all backgrounds, and they're like, I had a good experience here. So people have found a home, whatever their background, if it's ultra conservative or if it's, you know, very out. So people have found a way, and I think you have to find a way to institutionalize that so that you can continue to be vibrant. I hope that the school continues to welcome a variety of people here. I mean, I teach diversity. I believe in that. So I hope that there's a place for a range of people, and that's something you thrash out. I don't think it's going to be easy. And as I said, I don't think the racial stuff is going to be easy necessarily, but I do think people are together on that. I think people are like, okay, we've got to do this thing, and we have to figure out, and the school has become more diverse, and I think there are ways of talking about helping people feel like their culture is supported and all that. But I think the point of contention is just the LGBTQ stuff, and I'm really interested in the points of view of people on all perspectives. So.
I have one more question. So, when addressing diversity, or in addressing diversity, is it really something new?
No.
Hasn't this been an issue that many civilizations and other cultures have dealt with over the ages?
Yeah. Since the beginning of time, it's like, who's this person? As a matter of fact, when you look at, you know, the Greek society, anybody who wasn't Greek was like a barbarian. They didn't care who they were, you know. And the world we think of the world as being a violent and terrible place, but we've actually come quite far in terms of humanity. There's a lot to be hopeful about, that people have come to great agreements about live and let live. And in my presentation, I don't know if anybody saw 60 Minutes last week or the week before. I'm going to reference this. They looked at DNA for, you know, dogs and humans, and there seems to be a same place that in their DNA that seem to support survival, and they call it the friendly gene. So in fact, the ability to be kind and accepting is part of what helps us to survive. So, and I guess it keeps us from, you know, clobbering each other over the head with clubs. So I think that's one to keep in mind. And for in a religious setting here, talking about DNA, I also realize that you're talking about two areas that have been in tension for many centuries. So I go for that.
So, when learning about our ancestral roots, I hope we can gain some knowledge tonight to help us appreciate the bigger picture of who we are genetically. So, Dr. Foeman, the floor is yours.
Take it away. Thank you. Thank you. And as I said, I'm going to talk for about a half hour, give us a chance to have some dialogues otherwise. All right. This is work that I've been doing over the past 20 years. And I like to start out as I did, I think when I spoke here before, saying, first of all, everybody here is a winner. If you think about the history of humankind, there is absolutely zero chance that you should be here. Think about the, you know, millions of years ago when life slithered out of the ocean after the Big Bang. Like, what are the chances? And I often think, if you ever walked out in the street like a car almost hit you, and you think, oh, that could have killed me. And think about that happening every generation before you. And as I said, the chances of your coming here and sitting here in this spot in the United States of America is probably zero. And yet, you know, here you are. And so as I talk about this idea of identity and ancestry, I really think of it as miraculous. And I don't care what your religious background is, the story of our humanness is really a miracle. And I start out by looking at some of the theory about who we are and how we talk about who we are. And in your own families, I'm guessing there are narratives about your family's background and their ethnicity and how they came to be in this land. And so I look at the narratives that people have about who they are, and and give people tests, DNA tests. Let me ask you this. Have some of you taken ancestry tests? Has anybody here taken? Oh, wonderful. That's about half the people here. Find out anything interesting? Yeah, so, and some surprises, and it's sort of shocking, and something can go sort of off the rails at any point in your background. So what Fisher says is that people come up with stories that may or may not be consistent with what the actual genetics are, and it tells us something about the society that we live in. When I started doing this work, my department is communication and media, and so I didn't want to talk about something where I did not have any kind of information on the genetic history and sort of what I was talking about in terms of the genes. And so my colleague, who's our geneticist on campus, she's since retired. Now I work with our new geneticist on campus, directed me to read The Seven Daughters of Eve by Brian Sykes. And Brian Sykes had the first theory about identifying what our ancestry was by looking at genes. And people will often say to me, like, how did you get into this? And I had always been interested in the Human Genome Project. Has anybody heard of the Human Genome Project, where you're looking at people's genes? And so I just thought it was fascinating. They're mapping it to see, like, what are all the genes that make us who we are? And a friend, and I was so interested in it, people used to send me articles all the time, and a friend said, did you see this article that said that we can look at your genes and say what your ancestry is? And I thought, I bet there are people walking around with stories that are really inconsistent with what their genes tell them. And so Brian Sykes was one of the first people to say we can find out about your ancestry based on your genes. So he had a theory that you could look at somebody's genes in the past and figure out who they were, what their genetic ancestry was. And so he needed to get a sample from the oldest possible person that he could. And so I don't know if you remember the Iceman, the 5,000-year-old Iceman that they found in the Alps between Italy and Austria. And so he got permission to get a sample from the 5,000-year-old Iceman, and then was looking to see if he could find a person today who was directly related to the Iceman. Now remember, he found this sample from the Iceman who was between Italy and the Alps, between Italy and Austria. And indeed, he found somebody living in England. Her name was Marie Moseley, and she had the exact same DNA as the 5,000-year-old Iceman. And he goes on to say that could mean only one thing, that Marie was a direct relative of the Iceman. And then he says it was fascinating that after Marie Moseley discovered this, it said one of the strangest and first surprising things about, has a life of its own here. Oh, I think we may have, okay. But I can tell you basically what it says, that one of the most fascinating things was that she started to feel something for the Iceman, because in the past she had just seen him as, in articles in the newspaper, and suddenly she realizes she's related to him, and he's like, it's coming. Oh, I mean, because she still should show up there. And she realized that he's a relative of hers. And so as a result of this, as he's looking for this, she realized that we're all relatives. Now, today, most of you have seen the map of the human trek. Have people seen that? Where does everybody start out? Where does all human life start? Yes, subset, thank you. It's like he's working and he's answering questions. It starts in sub-Saharan Africa, and people then splayed out from there. And as a result of responding to the environment, et cetera, we started to look different ways. But in fact, we're all part of the same human family. And what people sometimes don't know is that there were other theories. Has everybody heard that, the out of Africa theory, that everybody comes out of Africa and we all... But there was one called the candelabra theory, where people started out in all different places and they evolved in different ways. And people, there were theories that people started in Europe because, the Europeans thought that, they must be the beginning of life. And so this was a breakthrough. This was like a major breakthrough, right? That's what he looked like in better days. But there's the human trek, where people came out of Africa and traversed the globe. And so I just showed Brian Sykes before, who collected a lot of data, genetic data out of Europe. And this is Rick Kittles, who actually spoke at Westchester, where I am, who collected a lot of data out of Africa. At one time, he had the largest database of DNA, in African DNA in the world, but now the company that we use does. And what they say is that people have continued to change and evolve genetically. Think about it. Before, when people had to move around on boats or whatever, and they still managed to get around the world, but people partly thought that there were different groups, because if somebody took a ship and sailed from, like, Iceland to Africa, they looked like totally different people. But there's not any style. It's an unbroken line where people are moving around the world, and so people are evolving and changing the way they look. And what this some of the movement's not there. What this theory is that we continue to change, and more rapidly, because now you get on a plane and you meet somebody across the world, and there are all kinds of genetic combinations that would have been very uncommon a generation ago, though it's still happening. All you need is a guy with a bike. He comes in the neighborhood, and there's a gene pool. But we looked at 3 elements that I want to share with you pretty quickly: the protocol that we use, some of the results, and some of the discussion. And our protocol has not changed over the last 20 years. The first 5 years, I was doing this all by myself, and then my colleague helped me do some of the statistical analysis of it. But from the beginning to today, the first thing we do is ask people what their story is. So if I went around and said, what does your family say about your story? What's your background? What's your ethnicity? I could get a bunch of stories from you. Then we DNA test people. And then we say, well, what's the relationship between this story and how you see yourself? Do you think there's some secrets in there? Do you think there's surprises? And let me just ask you, do any of you think there might be some secrets or gaps in your family background? That is so often there. People, when we give this question in a clicker, and it's anonymous, sometimes 90% of people say that there are secrets and gaps in their family. So it's not surprising. And this is just one generation. And then suddenly people find out, like, generations back. And one of the things that we find out when we do big projects every time is that people start finding relatives that they did not know that they had. And the interesting, when I first started this, I got a grant that was for people who wanted to look at diversity in unusual ways. And I had been doing this reading, and so I was saying, I'm going to do this thing on people's ancestry. Nobody knew what I was talking about. I had to find a lab that would do the testing for me, and every kit was $450. For those of you who've been tested, how much did you pay for your kit? Yeah, okay, 100, and now you can even get them on sale for I think Ancestry is on sale now for $50. So just imagine how that changed things. And by the time that the kits came down to $150, we had already been doing research for years, and so suddenly, like, we were the guys in town to talk to about it, and that's how we got all over the place. And I'm actually doing another project now for great courses, so I have something new coming out. And so at Westchester, we've just been doing this for years and years, and then we have our conversations about what people found. And so I want to share with you some of the things that we have. These are all the people that I run around testing, and Bessie, the other young woman there, is my research partner. The first thing I always like to say is that human beings, you probably know this, are all 99.9% exactly the same. Wherever you find a person, they are 99.9% the same. And as we will see here, sometimes that last 0.1% we're not even right about. So we are basically exactly the same. And one of the questions that I get, and I don't think I was doing this the last time that I gave this, one of the questions that I get is, what are they looking at when they look at these genes. And so they're looking at millions of variants in your genes. But I thought I'd pick 3 to give people an idea of what variants we're talking about. And so I'm looking at a gene that identifies, they call them ancestry informative markers. So these are variants, one that identifies people who are of European ancestry, African ancestry, and Asian ancestry, because those are sort of the 3 biggies. So the HERC2-GG variant for eyes. Anybody here have blue eyes? That is one of the most ancestry informative markers for European background. So if somebody has light eyes like that, they probably have some European background, even if they don't identify as white. And the interesting thing is that before 10,000 years ago, and in terms of ancestry and genetics, that's like this long. Before 6,000 to 10,000 years ago, everybody had brown eyes. And somebody had the variant that was blue eyes. And it's so specific that they think maybe one person was the person who started blue eyes. And they don't know if there was some benefit in blue eyes, like you get more light in cold climates, or if people were like, that guy's got blue eyes, he's very cute. So we do not know where, and they think it's from a male a donor. So that's one of the most ancestry informative markers for European background. One of the most ancestry informative markers for Asian background is this EDAR, GG, and it relates to the dark, straight hair, and also certain body types and certain jawline. And in fact, they said that both African people, African ancestry, and Europeans tend to have more distinction between male and female facial shape, whereas Asians, partly because of this, sorry, we lost it again, this GG variant, can you get it? Oh, we're back. Variant tend to look more androgynous and have a cute look. But this is one of the most ancestry informative markers if you have Asian background. And I compared these all to myself. I have one marker for blue eyes and one marker for brown. And since that's dominant, I have brown eyes. Very common for African Americans to have European ancestry. But as a matter of fact, African Americans tend to have around 20% European ancestry because of the history of this country. I had 23%, which is right in there. I had totally no Asian hair or vice type, so it was totally different. Though it's interesting, Native Americans will have this GG type. And so many times you see somebody who is Native American and they look Asian. You know, there's a lot of, and in fact, in the early tests, Native Americans were testing as Asian because, you know, they came over that Bering Strait into the Americas through Asia. And then finally, and I do have this, we're not sure if they called it the dark gene because of its identification with Africans, but this is and it stands for the Duffy antigen. It is one of the first gene variants that was identified by race. And it is one of the most race identifying for people who are African ancestry as myself. And, and I do have that. And it was like the sickle cell. It was a response to malaria. So that was yet another one. Okay? It's going and it's coming back. Okay. And if I can go to the next. So those are the 3. I thought I would mention here that 60 Minutes last a couple of weeks ago is now, and people, even when I was starting out, people were saying that I should look at people's pets for kids, their pet DNA. Has anybody done a DNA test for their pet? And they're actually, what did you, she says sheepishly. Yeah, it is fascinating. And we're all made out of DNA. And as I said, there's a parallel. They're doing some research on cancer, et cetera. And they found that in dogs and people, that survival seemed to be associated with the friendly gene. So friendly people get to procreate more. And it's in the book. I had actually read the book Humankind there, where they talk about it in some detail. So I wanted to share some of the results with you. And I'm just going to run through these because, as I said, I wanted to leave us some time to get a chance to chat. But here's how people identify versus how their genetics came up. And this was a young woman who identified as white. She's from Colombia, And so she had this background, which surprised her, but not totally. But the one that surprised her the most was the Native American. Now, somebody from Colombia, you would think she could have some indigenous in her, but she was talking about the prejudice that people have against indigenous people. And so in the narrative, you just drop that narrative. If something embarrassing happens in your family, I don't know how your families are, but we just don't talk about it. And so it's like, that's gone from our narrative. And so, you just drop it until somebody gives you a DNA test. Here was somebody who said he had a Cherokee grandmother, but she wasn't Cherokee. She was black. And just think of the stigma that was associated with African ancestry. But I find it fascinating that we have these romantic stereotypes about Native Americans, but look how they were treated. As a matter of fact, in the first 100 years after 1492, 90% of the Native American population was eliminated. That's how people felt about Native Americans. And so to have somebody tell this narrative about a Cherokee grandmother is fascinating, when in fact, this is far more likely for many people. She identifies as African American, but the lab at first identified her as Hispanic, which is a long story because Hispanic is not a geographic region. But when we asked them to retest her without Hispanic, this is how she came up. And then we discovered that we've used many labs over the years. We discovered that the lab was a lab for forensics, and so they were trying to more identify the way people look. So if the police are trying to track you down, it's like Hispanic woman. So they were more identifying how somebody looks than what their culture was. So I like to give this little test. How many of these people do you think have African ancestry? And by the way, this is the easiest test you'll ever take. How many people? There you go. They all do. They all do. And that's going to be the answer for these. Oopsie. These people, how many of them have Asian ancestry? And the woman in the middle went to China, and she said people kept saying to her, "You look Chinese." And then so it was funny that she came up with. Lainey is the woman on the end there is Russian Jewish in her background. And of course, you keep going east in Russia, and you're in Asia. So it's not surprising because these are geographic. Let's see if it'll help if I click. These people all had Native American in their background, and it'll be easy to wind up fast since I don't have these slides. Okay, we'll see if it comes back. But and I want to give us a chance to talk. So maybe it's a good place to sort of to summarize. Ultimately, this is that's a long story. Okay, this woman, it was fascinating because she identifies as 100% Italian, and this sort of relates back to the question that President Blair asked, was, did diversity just start here? She identifies as 100% Italian, and when we tested her, she came up with all this diversity, and she was like, but my parents come from Italy. Well, Italy was the center of the world, and people came from all kinds of places through Italy, and most of her African was North African. It was all through the Middle East, and so it's really not uncommon to find somebody who's Italian who have that background. And also, around here, a lot of people have Italian background. Well, because we're at this church and it has a particular history. But does anybody here identify as Italian or having Italian background? Are both of your parents, how Italian are you is the question? Okay. Okay. Yeah, and it's not uncommon. Yeah, yes, and as I said, a lot, especially North African, would not be uncommon in that. But at Westchester, where we have lots and lots of Italian students, people they'll have an Irish mother. They'll still call themselves Italian. They use a narrative that works for them. This is very cute. This guy is half Korean, and his dad is Irish. And he says he'll go places and he sees people like, he said, I'll see an old Korean lady look at me like, I think I recognize you, but I'm not sure. And he says, he starts speaking Korean. He said to me, Dr. Foeman, my Korean is tight. I speak great Korean. And he said, they immediately say, I want you to meet my granddaughter. It's like, okay. But the point of all of these, as we pop through these, is that people tell narratives that help them survive, that help them fit in around, that are neat. But the world is messy. And maybe that's the message for all of us. Like once we get underneath some of those neat, clean narratives, that there are all kinds of complicated conversations that we want to have among ourselves. And we found over and over again that people will tend to lean into narratives that help them survive. And so as you talk to people, the more open you are about hearing their stories, the more stories you will hear because their narratives can expand. And so I know that was kind of a quick pop through of these, especially since, as I said, it's going in and out. So I don't want to, and I wanted to leave a good amount of time for people to have some conversations and to ask some questions. So are you okay? So let me open it up. First of all, if anybody wants to comment on their own findings in the DNA, or if you want to comment on some of the kinds of discussions that I've been having with people on this campus, I would love that. Yes.
I just wanted to say.
We have a lot of people online.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Just quickly, I just wanted to say that I lived 3 days in a Cherokee tribe, and there are lots of Cherokee blacks. So the man who said he was Cherokee could still be Cherokee.
Oh, absolutely. And there's a lot of discussion among Cherokee about who gets to be in and who gets to be out. There's a certain amount of tension. Yes. Were you hearing some of that?
What?
Were you hearing some of that when you were?
Not really. That was political.
Yes.
That was a lot of political.
Yes. Question?
I was going to say, my mother told me when I was young that I was mostly English, but a smidgen of Scottish, 2 smidgens of Irish, and just a pinch of German. I got my Ancestry.com thing back. Basically, she was right.
Yep. Yeah, and apparently people who keep really good records of the family are often right about it. And some families, in my family, if there was a divorce or somebody stopped speaking, we acted like you never existed. In other families, they keep really good records, and so it's a matter, like for us, the narrative carries the day. For other people, being precise and keeping those genetic records is really important. So I'm guessing your family's pretty good about doing that. Thank you. Yes, she was. Any other comments or questions? And please comment on our discussion about the what I found in my interviews.
I can do it without the mic. There's people online. Sure. I'm curious, with the 99.9% similarity, it always struck me, and I wonder your opinion on this, is we're so similar, but yet psychologically we struggle with seeing more differences than similarities in others. And I sometimes wonder, is it race or is it culture that we're responding to? And in other words, okay, I think you know what I...
Who's the outside? Everybody, and again, back to the question you were asking me, every society has had an other. You know, there's always some person who, is like, not him. You saw the Star Wars thing. It's like, not him. They can't come here. And so, yes, we're in some ways, we're struggling against this part of us who wants to talk about them and us. And to me, and I don't know that I think that is a kind of survival mechanism too, like I'm going to protect my group and identify where the threat is coming from. But I do think, now here's my hopeful self, that as we evolve, as we evolve and find more ways to be inclusive and not afraid of one another, that there will be more of an opportunity to see our similarities. Because as you said, we're 99.9% the same. And I would also say, you were talking about being on a Cherokee, was it a reservation? That when I talk to people who are Native American, they extend it beyond people. We were talking about dogs; they could send it to the world and the earth, and that we should not think of our dominion over those things. And I think there's actually some of Swedenborg that it supports some of that. So yeah, I think we have these forces that pull on us. So I think it's inevitable. But that's a great question. But I don't have the definitive answer. Anybody else want to jump in and comment on stuff we've been talking about? Yes. Jump. Yes, with the dog.
In all your studies, did you ever find anyone who was a full percent of what they thought they were?
People usually had a little something else, but occasionally, somebody I work with is Polish, and her family was and she came up as 100% Polish. And the tests have actually gotten more defined. For example, I had a student who said she was Vietnamese. We tested her, she came up as almost all Chinese. She went to talk to her parents, and they're like, yeah, we are Chinese, but our whole population moved because of some political upheaval, moved to Vietnam, and then they started to identify as Vietnamese. Now, over time, these geneticists will be able to identify that population that moved, and they'll start to call them Vietnamese. And so the labs have gotten better at that. They're best with it in Europe because that's where the biggest database is. But so over time, some people have actually become less complex rather than more. The same, because you can go back in and recheck your DNA, they update it. So sometimes they will, in the past you may have been 3 things, but then they're like, nah, he's really Indian, from India. So does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah, okay.
Can I ask a bigger question?
Yeah, bigger.
You started off the talk by talking about diversity, equality, and belonging. How, or maybe you've written a book or something, do you have resources for how we help other people feel like they belong once we've invited them here? Because those of us who grew up in this, very white, very church-based town, we want to welcome others, but how do we have those tools or learn them?
And that's a great question. And we are going to be talking about, I'm going to throw some of that out to maybe see if other people want to comment on it. But are there populations that you're finding that may not be as feeling? What are you finding? Are you a faculty person? Gotcha. Gotcha. Yes. That's a yes, and I would say, and I'm going to be working with the diversity committee here some, there are many things that you can do, and sometimes you can start with small things, but one of the things that I love is to have student panels where you have students like you, and they can identify, what groups they want to have. Like maybe have 3 students who are adopted, talk about their experience and have them answer questions. And they have to volunteer to do that. And you can even have students set up some of the panels so that they're talking to each other. Because what you want to do is create an environment where people are having comfortable conversations, and that's a standard. And if they feel uncomfortable, they feel like they can come to you. And so you can also, in your materials that you read in class, try to bring stories that relate to the students who are in class. And I know that there's a whole, controversy about what students read. There are a million things out there that you would love to have students read. You can even have students write their own narratives and share them with the class. But I think those things go a long way to open people up. My son, who was adopted, just, I had never seen him cry. He burst into tears about something that had just happened to him. And like he said, I felt so much better having expressed that. So I think just giving people a chance to tell a story that they had not been able to tell is just so potent. So does that answer? And if anybody else wants to jump, what have you seen that has made people feel welcome? Are there students here who've had things happen to them that made them feel like they really care about me or wish they had done something? All right. Yes, please.
Okay, so for me, I mean, I look different than most people around here, but I like it especially when you just treat me like anybody else that's around here,
Okay.
I guess you can say.
Okay. Yeah, so you don't want somebody like, and thank you for like standing up in the middle of everybody. That you just want to be like everybody else, and so yeah, and let me give you a couple of small things. Make sure you pronounce people's names properly, that you know people's names, because there's nothing that makes somebody feel like on the outs like, my name is so impossible to say that they, you know, because I will hear teachers, and I understand. I mean, I grew up with kids, Derek, Daryl, Michael, you know, and so sometimes it can feel tricky to learn students' names. And I would really not put that on the student to correct. If I say it wrong, you correct me. No, talk to other people and find out how to say it. So that's just one little thing. But thank you for that. Anybody else? Speak now. Yes. Yeah. Yep.
Roughly, how many years back does the DNA trace for the DNA tests?
And I would say more that it's like, what did you inherit? And one of the things that you find, for example, somebody will say, well, we're talking about Native American. Somebody will say, I think I have Native American in the background. Then they'll take the test, and it doesn't show up. That does not mean that you don't have a great-grandmother who's Native American. You may not have inherited the gene that they look for in, you know, in their research. So it's not so much about how far back it goes, but what you have inherited and what you've not gained. Because, you know, something could continue. And the more people are similar, the more likely it is, if everybody in your, like the person who was Polish, everybody in her background had a very similar profile. So they kept replicating the same things. So there might have been one person way back there who was from, you know, out of town, and eventually it just got, you know, reproduced out of her background. Does that make sense as an answer? Thank you. And I think there's somebody else. Oh, yes.
Thank you. Now you're talking about me because, and this is a question that I had that came up when I was talking with my family at dinner. My family story growing up was that my father was a quarter Cherokee. And we know exactly where in the ancestry his grandmother or great-grandmother was. There was a picture of her. There was a whole lore in the family of family members being able to get a job building a skyscraper because supposedly Native Americans were willing to walk up high in the construction because of who and what they were. And when my father took a DNA test, it came back completely negative. No Native American at all, which was a surprise to him. And now he can't joke about how, you know, a quarter of him is Native American.
Yeah.
Would there be any benefit in having his siblings take a test? Do siblings potentially inherit differently and show?
Sure.
So his, and that wouldn't mean that he's any less Native American.
Well,
Or
I mean,
how do we?
Anybody have a sibling who looks nothing? Well, we get into a whole different story about that. But I know a set of twins, okay? I know a set of twins. She is tall and blonde, and he's short and dark. They don't even look like siblings, but they're twins. And so, number one, absolutely yes, you could have somebody who was Native American. And there are two issues with that. First of all, if you didn't inherit it, like I said, what they're looking for is going to say no. And the second thing, Native Americans have been very hesitant to give their DNA samples because they don't like some of the stuff that happens with their DNA samples, which is an interesting thing because sometimes some of it goes into medical research, which is a whole nother controversy. And if you're not in those databases, you don't get the benefit of that. So yes, it certainly could be. And so I tell people when they're doing research on their family, this is just one piece of the puzzle, that there are paperwork and other things. But we find all the time that people don't have the relatives they thought. So keep your mind open. Keep your mind open, because every blessed time we do it, we find somebody who does not have a parent that they thought they had. So that's always like, oh, God. Yeah. Hi, how you feel? Yes, please.
I'm wondering if you could speak to actually like sort of the terms we use for races, because someone, you know, from, I don't know, Morocco is going to be obviously not very closely related to someone from South Africa. Like, it seems a little with
At random or
random, like it's just like we pick the continent rather than like the actual genetics. I want like, but you would know more than I about that.
That's a fabulous question. And number one, in the past, if you were Asian or African of ancestry, you'd look at the map and it would be like, you have African ancestry, and there'd be a circle around the entire continent. Or they'd say you're Asian, there'd be a circle out there from India to China, and they just didn't have a good database. As they get better, and for a while they are giving free kits to anybody who had 2 African grandparents. No, sorry, I guess 2 African parents. And I have a friend a colleague who's out in San Francisco who gives, where there's a much larger Asian population, who gives free kits out to people who are Asian. So they're building up those databases. And all you're looking at, and sometimes there's some labs that identify somebody as a European Jewish, and I had, like, when that comes up, there's a whole conversation. This guy's like, why is it saying I'm Jewish? I'm not, I'm Catholic. But what they are saying is you can all, and the kid's name was like, Aaron Goldstein. It was very ethnic. But I said, anytime a population is segregated like that, they can find a genetic similarity. So it doesn't have to be, in some ways it's random, what they're calling race or, whatever. And I gave this talk to a group of people who are all like scientists, biologists, and they were getting to an argument after if race, can you call anything race? And some of them were saying, yes, you can, and some of them were saying, no, you're not. But they are looking at genes. And just one last thing, it's a long answer to a pretty straightforward question. When I was first looking at my own profile, there was Ashkenazi Jew in my background, and somebody said, you better look at this because there are some disabilities that are, and we have a daughter with a disability. And I said, how can my daughter have, first of all, I'm in an interracial marriage, he's not Jewish, and I'm not Jewish. She said, it doesn't matter what you call yourselves. If they got the gene, they got the disease. So so much of it is vague, and these tests don't come from, the Lord above. People make them up, people read them, and we're like at the tip of the iceberg of this stuff. So I hope some of you go into the sciences because it's fascinating stuff. So we got a chance to talk about some of the DNA stuff, and I hope I responded a little bit to some. Did anybody want to comment on the LGBTQ stuff? I don't want to leave without letting somebody make it. Yes. So I can start an argument right at the end.
I think it's a mistake to refer to the LGBTQ plus community as a homogeneous group. They are not. They're a bunch of groups. And some of them may be more acceptable to us than others. I don't think we should lump them all and say we should treat all these people this way because they identify as part of the spectrum. No.
Judge people as individuals.
Well, beyond that, there's a group that's homosexuals. There's another group that believes in total promiscuity.
Oh, but they're heteros.
Pardon?
You don't have to be gay to be that way. But you know what I'm saying? Does that make sense? Yeah, I mean, do you know what? Does that make sense? There are people who are not gay who are that way. Promiscuous.
Yeah.
Gotcha.
There's a lot of variety, but I don't think they should be lumped together.
Yeah. Oh, yes. And you know what? I think that you're saying that's really important to base people on their behavior and on the values that they bring, rather than some category.
Yeah.
Well said. Maybe that's a good place to stop. Anybody want to add anything? Or, as I said, let me just start a big old argument at the end. So listen, thank you very much for being here. And I hope that this is just the beginning of the conversation about race, about identity, about LGBTQ, and so much more. So thank you for being here, and it was a pleasure. Sorry for our echo.
Thank you very much. We'll be doing some more. As a college, as I said, we have a committee that's working on the diversity issues Dr. Foeman is advising us. Actually, Reverend Andy Dibb is chairing this committee, so we are bringing in a lot of different folks to help us with that. But what I hope you heard tonight, which is really important, is that we want to look at this in a positive way. The writings speak about the beauty of diversity, and we have so much that we can gain from learning from each other while respecting the tenets that we have and what we believe in as far as our faith is concerned. So it's a challenge, it's tricky, but I just want you to know the college and the administration, and I think most of our supporters want us to find the best way to figure this out, and we're taking that attitude. It's positive. Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening.